Hey guys, thanks for clicking in. Tonight we're talking about the insane whaling industry in the 19th century. Believe it or not, sailors used to go on hunting expeditions to hunt whales for their blubber, which could be turned into oil to help with the progression of the Industrial Revolution. But before we begin, if you enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. In the 1800s, men set sail into some of the most unforgiving waters on Earth. Not for gold, not for glory, but for the oil locked deep within the body of the planet's largest creature. These were voyages that could last years, pushing crews through freezing storms, weeks of dead calm, and the endless, horizon-to-horizon emptiness of the sea. At any moment, the hunt could turn into chaos. One swipe of a whale's tail could shatter a boat like matchwood, sending men into waters where hypothermia or drowning claimed lives in minutes. Disease, malnutrition, and mutiny were constant threats, and returning home, well, it was never guaranteed. Yet the rewards were considered worth it. Whale oil lit the lamps of booming cities, greased the gears of the Industrial Revolution, and powered a growing global economy. From streetlights in London to the finest perfumes in Paris, the products of whaling touched nearly every part of daily life in the 19th century. And without it, society as it was then might have developed far more slowly. But beneath this image of progress was an ugly truth. These voyages were built on the relentless slaughter of intelligent, social beings, creatures that sang to one another in the deep, that traveled in family pods, and that had roamed the oceans for millions of years. In just decades, human greed would push some whale populations to the brink of extinction, a bloody shadow cast across the century's age of progress. This is the story of danger, ambition, and moral blindness, an industry that fueled the modern world, even as it destroyed part of it. So who in their right mind actually signed up for a whaling voyage in the 1800s? Well, let's just say these ships weren't exactly filled with the cream of society's crop. Ports like Nantucket and New Bedford were always looking for crew. But here's the problem. Whaling, it was miserable. You could be gone for 3 to 5 years, crammed into a damp wooden ship that smelled like a mix between unwashed socks and, well, dead whale. So no, recruitment wasn't exactly the easiest. Whaling crews were a strange patchwork. You had farm boys looking to escape their quiet towns, sailors who couldn't get hired anywhere else, poor immigrants hoping for a new start. And let's be honest, a fair number of guys who are running away from debts, bad marriages, or the law. Basically, if you could pull a rope and didn't mind the risk of being eaten by sharks, you were in. And then there was the captain. Was it a prestigious position? Well, yes and no. A whaling captain had power, authority, and the final say on everything aboard. But instead of leading a sleek naval vessel, he commanded a floating oil factory that occasionally tried to sink itself. The good ones were part mariner, part businessman, part therapist, and part prison warden. The bad ones, well, let's just say those voyages got real long, really fast. As for the money, that's where things get a little tricky. Whalers didn't exactly get paid a salary. They worked for a lay, a share of the profits from the voyage. Captains could make the modern equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars if they struck oil, literally. But the average sailor, sometimes after years at sea, he came home with enough to buy a nice coat and maybe a sandwich. Whaling was high risk, high reward for a lucky few. And for everyone else, it was high risk, low pay, and low hygiene. So what was life like actually once you stepped into a whaling ship in the 1800s? Well, imagine an apartment where 30 guys share one bedroom, nobody showers for 3 years, and your landlord is the ocean. That's a pretty good start. Sleeping quarters? Forget cozy hammocks and sea breezes. Ordinary sailors, called green hands, on their first voyage, slept in tiny bunks below deck, packed so tightly that you could smell your shipmate's breath in your sleep. And if you were unlucky, your bunk was right under the tryworks, the massive iron furnace used to boil whale blubber, which meant your ceiling literally dripped warm, greasy whale oil onto you at night. Nothing says sweet dreams quite like that. If you've ever complained about airplane food, congratulations. You would not have survived a single week on a whaling ship. Meals at sea were all about one thing, and that thing was survival. Forget fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. Those were gone after the first few weeks. After that, the crew lived on what was cheap, preserved, and could survive years in a damp ship's hold. The star of the show was hardtack, a biscuit so hard, sailors joked you could use it as a hammer. Made of flour, water, and salt, it was baked until it could last forever, which it often did, because sometimes your hardtack had been baked years before you set sail. And fresh out of the barrel, it might have, well, a little bit more protein than you bargained for. Yes, bugs in it. Most sailors just knocked them out on the table and ate it anyway. But hey, it's protein, right? Then there was salt pork and salt beef. Meats packed in barrels of brine so strong it could pickle a boot. To make it edible, you had to soak it for hours to leach out some of the salt. And even then, it tasted like chewing on a piece of the ocean. If you were lucky, you might get saltfish instead, which was basically the same idea, but smelled like it died twice. Beans were a common staple because they kept well and filled you up. Though with 30 men crammed into a ship, you can imagine the atmosphere that it created below deck. For variety, there was duff, a boiled pudding of flour and water, occasionally sweetened with molasses if the ship had any left. On birthdays or special occasions, the cook might toss in a few raisins. But raisins were so rare, sailors joked you had to sign a treaty just to get one. And drinks? Water was stored in wooden casks, and over time, it got stale, slimy. It tasted faintly of whatever the barrel used to hold. Some sailors preferred grog, a watered-down rum ration. But whaling voyages often banned alcohol entirely to keep tempers in check. And then there was the ship's bread pudding, lobscouse stew, and occasionally sea pie, all made from whatever odds and ends were left over. And in desperate times, crews might eat seabirds or fish caught along the way, but even that was rare. By the end of a long voyage, the food wasn't just unappetizing, it was actually dangerous. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies like scurvy were common. Teeth loosened, gums bled, and cuts healed slowly. The crew might have dreamed of a big, fresh meal back home, but until then, it was hardtack, beans, and salty mystery meat, again and again and again. And the smell? Oh, the smell. Whaling ships had a very distinct aroma. A mix of sweat, mildew, stale tobacco, and of course, whale. Once the hunting began, barrels of blubber were stacked on deck, leaking oil in the sun. Add in the tryworks, belching out greasy smoke, and the fact that laundry days were basically non-existent, and you've got a scent so strong it could probably knock a seagull out of the air. And the workload? Well, it was brutal. You might spend days on lookout duty, staring at empty seas, or be suddenly called to launch the small whaleboats when a lookout shouted, "There she blows." That meant rowing for hours, harpooning a multi-ton animal that was not thrilled about the arrangement, and then butchering it, sometimes right there in the open ocean, while sharks, circled you below. A whaling ship was basically a floating factory, and just like any workplace, everyone had a job, whether they liked it or not. So first off is the captain. He's the big boss. He made all of the decisions: where to sail, when to hunt, and how to divide the profits. His word, it was the law, and disobeying him could get you whipped, locked up, or worse. A good captain could keep a crew motivated for years at sea. A bad one could turn the voyage into a floating nightmare. How about the first mate, the second mate, and the third mate? The captain's deputies. They ran the day-to-day operations, supervised the deck crew, and commanded the small whaleboats during a hunt. The first mate was basically the ship's drill sergeant. The second mate often handled navigation and discipline. The third mate usually got stuck with the less glamorous duties. Think assistant manager, but with more harpoons. Next up are the boat steerers. These guys had one of the most dangerous jobs on the ship. When a whale was spotted, they were the ones to throw the harpoon from the small whaleboat, getting close enough to an angry, thrashing, multi-ton animal to basically poke it with a spear. The harpooner's skill could mean the difference between a full barrel of oil or rowing home empty-handed. Now we're going to move on to coopers. They were the barrel makers. Since whale oil had to be stored in wooden barrels, coopers, they were essential. Without them, the entire trip, well, it was pointless. They also repaired barrels mid-voyage, which sometimes meant working in cramped, rolling conditions while covered in oil. Believe it or not, they even had a blacksmith on board. The blacksmith kept the ship's tools, harpoons, and cutting gear in shape. The blacksmith also fixed broken iron fittings and sometimes made custom weapons for the crew. There was also a carpenter. The carpenter was responsible for repairing the ship itself, patching holes, fixing masts, and generally keeping the vessel from falling apart halfway across the Pacific. Then there's the steward, the captain's personal assistant. They handled his meals, his laundry, and his quarters. This was not a job you wanted if the captain was a perfectionist. Next up, the cook. The cook fed the entire crew 3 times a day, using whatever questionable ingredients were left in the hold. The cook had one of the most thankless jobs on board. If the food was bad, morale dropped. And if it was good, well, it was never good. The green hands were the rookies. They were the first-time sailors who got all the worst jobs: scrubbing the decks, hauling lines, scraping barnacles, or standing lookout for hours in the blazing sun. Ordinary seamen were experienced sailors who handled sails, rigging, and general seamanship tasks. They were basically the muscle that kept the ship moving. And lastly, coastal and foreign hires. Whaling crews were often multinational: Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, freed black sailors, and men from all over Europe might be hired on at different ports, each taking on whatever role they were suited for. In short, a whaling ship was like an office. If your office was constantly wet, smelled like burning fat, and had the occasional giant animal trying to kill you. So what did they do for entertainment? Well, don't get your hopes up. With no phones, no radios, and no Netflix, sailors entertained themselves with singing sea shanties, carving scrimshaw out of whalebone, telling wildly exaggerated stories, and occasionally getting into fights over card games. And since alcohol was usually banned on long voyages, tempers could get as sour as the ship's drinking water. If life aboard a whaling ship wasn't already tough enough, there was another invisible danger that stalked the crew: disease. Think about it. 30 to 40 men cramped into a damp, poorly ventilated wooden box for years at a time. Fresh air was limited, hygiene was minimal, and everyone shared the same water and food supply. If one sailor caught something, the odds were good that everyone else would too. And some common illnesses? Well, scurvy was a big one, thanks to the complete lack of fresh vegetables and fruits. It started with bleeding gums and fatigue, then escalated to joint pain, open sores, and if untreated, death. Dysentery caused by bad food or contaminated water could sweep through the ship, leaving the crew weak and dehydrated. Tuberculosis, typhus, and ship fever were also common. Even a bad cold could linger for weeks in the damp air. And then there were injuries: harpoon accidents, burns from the tryworks furnace, crushed fingers from hauling lines, or falls from the ringing. But then that begs the question, if you were sick or if you got injured, who treated you? Well, here's the bad news. Most whaling ships didn't have a doctor. Instead, the captain or the first mate played doctor with whatever supplies were in the ship's medicine chest. That might include opium, mercury, and various herbal remedies. You might also get treated with hot poultices, bloodletting, or, if the situation was dire, amputation. If you were lucky, there might be one sailor on board with some previous medical experience, maybe a formal naval surgeon or someone who'd worked in a hospital. But more often than not, treatment was improvised, and survival depended on your body's ability to fight off the illness. And the worst part? If you died at sea, there was no one bringing you home. Your shipmates would sew you into your hammock, weigh it down with a cannonball or heavy stones, and bury you at sea, sometimes within hours of your last breath. In short, life aboard a whaling ship was cold, wet, smelly, exhausting, and dangerous. But for some, the promise of adventure, or just the need for a paycheck, was enough to sign up again and again and again. For everyone else, one voyage was more than enough to last a lifetime. After weeks, and sometimes months, of starting in empty water, the moment every whaling voyage was waiting for would arrive in an instant. The lookout's cry would ring over the ship, "There she blows!" Somewhere ahead, a jet of spray burst from the ocean. It was the sign of a whale surfacing to breathe. The ship would erupt into motion. The captain would quickly judge whether to give chase. If the decision was yes, the mates barked orders, and the crew scrambled to lower the small whale boats. Slender, open vessels about 25 to 30 feet long. Each was manned by a mate or boat steerer, several rowers, and a harpooner at the bow. Getting close to a whale was an art. Whales could dive for up to an hour, and if startled, they might vanish entirely. Crews rowed in silence. The only sound was their oars dipping into the water and the wind in the sail, if they dared to use it. The goal was to get within striking distance without alerting the animal. When the boat steerer judged they were close enough, maybe 30 feet away, the harpooner would stand and brace against the bow. This was the most dangerous moment. In one swift motion, he would hurl the harpoon, aiming for the whale's back, near its lungs. The sharp iron head would hit deep, and the line, a thick rope coiled in a wooden tub, raced out at a terrifying speed as the whale would dive. If that line snagged around a crewman's leg, it could drag him overboard and under within seconds, a fate sailors called being stove in, or taking a Nantucket sleigh ride, straight to the bottom. Once struck, the whale often fled at incredible speed, towing the boat for miles. This was the infamous Nantucket sleigh ride, exhilarating and deadly. The crew clung to their seats as the whale pulled them through the waves, the line sizzling with heat as it ran. Sometimes the chase ended quickly, other times it lasted hours. Eventually the whale would tire and surface, heaving great breaths. This was when the mate moved forward with the lance, a long, sharp spear used to pierce the whale's vital organs, striking deep into the lungs or heart, causing the water to turn red in what sailors grimly called the spout of blood. The whale might thrash violently, smashing the boat with its flukes, or even capsizing it. Many whalemen were killed in these moments, crushed, drowned, or hurled into sea. When the whale was finally gone, it floated, massive and still. The crew tied it to the side of the ship, and the real work would begin: cutting in. This meant stripping huge slabs of blubber from the carcass using long spades and hooks. The blubber was hauled aboard and fed into the tryworks, a brick furnace on deck where it was boiled into oil. The smell was overpowering, burning fat and smoke thick into the air. The meat was often left to drift away, feeding gulls and sharks. For the crew, the hunt was over, until the next "there she blows" echoed from the crow's nest. It was dangerous, bloody, exhausting work, and yet it was the lifeblood of the whaling industry. Every barrel of oil meant more profit back home, and for some captains, every successful hunt was worth the risk, no matter the cost of human or animal lives. For the whalemen of the 1800s, this was a victory. A dead whale meant barrels of oil, profit in the captain's pocket, and wages, however meager, for the crew. But looking back, it's hard to see this scene as anything other than a tragedy. These hunts weren't taking just one whale. The industry, it took them in staggering numbers, tens of thousands every single year. Whole populations, like the North Atlantic right whale, were driven to the brink of extinction within a few decades. And the targets weren't just big animals. Whalers also took calves and mothers, shattering the social bonds of creatures known to travel in family groups and communicate through complex songs. Back then, whales were viewed as resources, not living beings. People didn't talk about their intelligence, their ability to navigate oceans thousands of miles wide, or their long lifespans, sometimes over a century. They didn't talk about grief in whale pods when one of their own was killed. To the whalers, this was business. To the whales, it was annihilation. And here's the hardest truth. Without whale oil, much of the 19th century world would have looked very different. The lamps that lit cities, the lubricants that kept industrial machines running, the corsets and buggy whips and perfumes, all of it was tied to this violence. Society's progress was built in part on boiling the bodies of the largest animals that ever lived. There's no way to soften it. Whaling in the 1800s was a perfect storm of human ingenuity, courage, greed, and moral blindness. The men who sailed out were risking their lives every day, but they were also helping to erase some of the ocean's greatest creatures from the earth. And when the whaling ships finally began to disappear in the late 19th century, it wasn't because humanity suddenly grew a conscience. It was because we found something cheaper, cleaner, and easier to get: petroleum. Whales weren't saved by compassion. They were saved by economics. So after hearing about spending months out at sea, bad food, disease, and the occasional chance of being flattened by a giant whale, you might be thinking, wow, whaling was one of the worst jobs in the 1800s. And you'd be right. But here's the thing. The 19th century was packed with terrible jobs. In fact, you didn't have to go anywhere near the ocean to find miserable, dangerous, soul-crushing work. Whether you were in a factory choking on coal dust, deep in a mine where a single spark could end your life, or hauling night soil through the streets for pennies, there was no shortage of ways to risk your health for a paycheck. So let's leave the rolling decks and reeking blubber behind for a moment and step onto dry land, where the jobs could be just as bad, if not worse. All right, we've just left the whaling ship behind. You're back on dry land, dry, for the first time in months, and you need work. Surely it can't get worse than chasing giant animals across the ocean, right? Welcome to the factory floor. Here, you'll spend 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, standing in front of a loud, clanking machine that occasionally tries to eat your fingers. The air is thick with coal dust, oil fumes, and cotton lint, so if you're lucky, you might just lose your hearing. If you're unlucky, you'll lose a limb and your hearing. And breaks? Well, you can rest your eyes when you collapse at home. Maybe you decide, nope, I'm going outside. I want fresh air. Great, let's try coal mining. You will crawl through narrow, damp tunnels by candlelight, breathing in dust that will eventually give you miner's lung. There's also the ever-present possibility of cave-ins, flooding, or gas explosions, which is why miners took canaries underground. If the bird dropped dead, you knew to run, assuming you could. Okay, you say, maybe something a little bit cleaner. How about chimney sweeping? It's simple. Just shimmy up a soot-coated chimney with a brush. Of course, if you get stuck, the only way down is with someone tugging at your legs. You'll inhale soot until it coats your lungs, and there's a good chance you'll develop chimney sweeps cancer, which was a very real and very deadly occupational hazard. Still too grim? Well, maybe you're not squeamish about smells, because cities needed night soil men. Yes, people whose job was to haul away human waste from privies and cesspits in the dead of the night. The pay wasn't terrible, but you would smell like human waste for the rest of your life. Not just at work. Always. Or perhaps you're feeling adventurous again. Why not be a matchstick maker? It's quiet, indoor work, with just one small problem. The phosphorus used to coat matches caused a horrific condition called phossy jaw, where your jawbone would literally decay while you were alive. The bright side? Your breath glowed faintly in the dark. Romantic, in kind of a creepy sort of way. So yes, life on land had its perks compared to whaling. You might not get dragged to your death by a 40-ton whale, but you would find about a dozen other ways to die, slowly, painfully, and probably while smelling terrible. So after all that, which would you choose? Months, maybe years, chasing whales across treacherous seas, eating bug-filled biscuits, and sleeping under a ceiling that drips hot oil? Or the factory floor, the coal mine, the chimney, or the back of a waste cart? It's a tough call, right? In the 1800s, your career options were basically a menu of, would you like to risk dying quickly or slowly? And whichever you picked, the pay usually left you just as poor enough to come back for more. We like to think of the 19th century as this grand age of progress, steamships, railroads, industry booming. And it was. But progress has a price, and that price was paid by ordinary workers whose daily reality was danger, exhaustion, and a complete lack of anything we recognize today as safety regulations. On the whaling ship, it was the courage and the desperation of the crew that filled the lamps of cities half a world away. On land, it was miners, sweepers, matchstick makers, and countless others who kept the wheels of industry turning, even when it slowly ground them down in the process. These were people who worked not because they loved the job, but because they had no choice. They risked their bodies and often their lives just to survive a world that didn't think twice about the cost. So the next time your boss schedules a meeting that could have been an email, or you grumble about having to work late, remember, at least you're not clinging to the side of a whaleboat while a 40-ton animal tries to smash you into driftwood, or dragging a barrel of human waste down a cobblestone street at night. The 1800s might have given us railroads, electricity, and the beginnings of a modern life, but for the people at the bottom, it was also an era of hard work, high risk, and low reward. And in the end, whether on sea or land, the story was the same. Someone always had to do the dirty work. History is full of stories like this, dangerous, messy, and often overlooked. If you want more tales from the grittier side of the past, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until then, stay curious, and maybe avoid any job that involves hot whale oil. That's it for this video, you guys. If you made it this far, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping that the embers will put you to sleep. See you later.